My name is Eleanor Price. I'm in my late 30s. I'm a consultant by profession, the kind who gets called when systems are messy and people don't quite know why things aren't working. I live alone now, but for most of my adult life, I was still very much orbiting my family, close enough to be useful, distant enough to be overlooked. If you asked people who know me casually to describe me, they'd probably say I'm calm, dependable, quietly competent, the one who listens more than she speaks, the one who doesn't make scenes. Even in my own family, that's how I was described, if I was described at all. I wasn't the dramatic one. I wasn't the problem. I also wasn't the priority. This story isn't about inheritance in the way people usually think about it. It's not about money or betrayal in a cinematic sense or a shocking twist designed to make anyone look evil. It's about something much quieter, something that unfolded without raised voices or slammed doors, something I learned not through an argument, but through paperwork. I found out my parents had changed their will without telling me while sitting in a lawyer's office. Not because someone confessed, not because there was a family meeting, but because my name was missing where I had always assumed it would be. And in that moment, I understood something that had been forming for years, but had never been said out loud. I learned my place in the family through a document, not a conversation. What followed wasn't revenge. It wasn't a confrontation, at least not in the way people expect. There were no dramatic ultimatums. What followed was a process, slow, internal, deliberate. A re-evaluation of my role, my silence, and the assumptions I had been living inside without questioning them. This is a story about emotional justice, not punishment. About what happens when you stop trying to be understood by people who benefit from misunderstanding you. About quiet dominance, not as control over others, but as control over your own choices once clarity arrives. I'm sharing this because I know how easy it is to normalize small exclusions, to explain them away, to tell yourself that being low maintenance is a virtue, and because sometimes the most defining moments of our lives don't come with speeches or confrontations, they come on letterhead, in neutral fonts, handed across a desk by someone who has no idea they're changing how you see everything. I'm telling this honestly, calmly, without exaggeration, not to make anyone look like a villain and not to present myself as a hero, just to trace the emotional arc of what happened and what changed in me because of it. So before we go any further, I want to ask you something gently. Have you ever realized where you stood with someone? Not because they told you, but because their actions quietly made it undeniable? For most of my life, I was the easy one. That was the word my parents used when they spoke about me to others. Eleanor's easy. Easy child, easy teenager, easy adult daughter. I didn't argue much. I didn't demand attention. I didn't need rescuing. Compared to my siblings, I seemed to arrive in the family fully formed, already adjusted, already reasonable. What that really meant, I would later understand, was that I asked for very little. At family gatherings, I was the one who arrived on time and stayed late. I helped clear plates without being asked. I remembered birthdays. I booked flights that worked around everyone else's schedules. I listened. I absorbed. I adapted. If there was tension in the room, I smoothed it over by becoming smaller, quieter, and more agreeable. No one ever told me to do this. That's the part that makes it so hard to explain. There was no explicit instruction to disappear. It was just efficient. The family functioned better when I didn't complicate things. And so over time, that became my role. I wasn't the disappointment, and I wasn't the pride. I existed in a middle space that felt safe, neutral. I told myself this was maturity, emotional intelligence. I was proud of being low maintenance. I wore it like a credential. When people talk about being underestimated, they often frame it as an insult. But in my family, it felt more like a convenience. They didn't doubt my competence. They just didn't consider my needs urgent enough to check in on. If I was quiet, it must be because I was fine. If I didn't ask, it must be because I didn't need. I was the daughter who would understand. That phrase came up a lot. Eleanor will understand. Understand why plans changed. Understand why decisions were made without looping me in. Understand why certain conversations happened when I wasn't there. And I did understand, logically. I could always find a reasonable explanation. Someone else needed more support. Someone else was going through something. This wasn't the right time. We'll tell her later. Later rarely came. What's strange is that I didn't feel mistreated. Not overtly. There was no cruelty, no sharp words, just a gradual pattern of omission. I wasn't asked for input on family decisions that affected everyone. I wasn't consulted. I was informed, sometimes after the fact, sometimes not at all. And because nothing felt dramatic, I never labeled it as a problem. In professional settings, my quiet nature was an asset. Clients trusted me, colleagues relied on me. I built a reputation on being steady and observant. But at home, that same steadiness translated into invisibility. I became part of the background architecture of the family, supportive, necessary, but not central. If I'm honest, there was comfort in that invisibility. Expectations were low. Conflict bypassed me. I could move freely because no one was watching closely. I didn't realize that the freedom I felt was, actually a lack of investment. The version of me my parents saw was frozen in time. Responsible, capable, not fragile. They didn't ask how I was doing because they assumed the answer would be fine. And most of the time, it was. Or at least, I told myself it was. I didn't protest my role because it came with praise of a certain kind. I was the sensible one. The independent one. The one who didn't need reassurance. That identity became self-reinforcing. Once you're labelled as someone who doesn't need much, asking for more feels like a betrayal of character. So I didn't. Looking back, I can see that my family didn't ignore me out of malice. They simply categorized me early and never revisited the classification. I fit neatly into a box labelled handled, and handled things that don't require attention. At the time, I believed that being unseen meant being unburdened. I didn't yet understand the cost of being absent from the mental maps people use when they make decisions about the future. That understanding would come later, slowly, and not through a conversation. The first time I felt it, I almost missed it. That's the thing about small cuts. You don't register them as injuries. They don't demand attention. They don't stop you from functioning. They just sting briefly, then fade into something you assume will heal on its own. For me, it happened during a conversation that wasn't even about me. We were all sitting around my parents' dining table. Nothing formal, just coffee, a half-cleared lunch, the quiet hum of familiarity. My parents were discussing a financial decision, something about restructuring assets, simplifying paperwork for the future. It was said casually, in the way people talk when they assume everyone present is already in the loop. I listened, as I always did, not intrusively, just present. At one point, my father said, "Well, we've already talked it through with the kids who need to be involved." Not the kids who need to be involved. He didn't look at me when he said it. No one did. The sentence landed, settled, and the conversation moved on. I remember feeling a slight pause inside myself. A quiet internal check. Did he just exclude me? And just as quickly, another voice followed. Of course not, he didn't mean it like that. I told myself they probably meant the ones who live closer, or the ones with more complicated lives, or the ones who had asked questions. There were a dozen reasonable explanations, and I accepted all of them without examining any too closely. That was my pattern. Interpreting ambiguity in the most charitable way possible. No one else reacted. No awkward silence, no correction. The absence of reaction made it feel like a non-event, so I treated it like one. I smiled, I nodded, I refilled someone's coffee. Later that day, I replayed the moment in my head, not with anger, but with curiosity. I tried to remember if there had been other moments like it. Other times, I'd been spoken around instead of to. I could think of a few, but they were fuzzy, unimportant, easy to dismiss. That's how normalization begins. The cut didn't come with pain, it came with confusion, a sense of being slightly out of frame, like a photo where you realize later that you were standing just beyond the edge. And because no one acknowledged it, I didn't either. Over the next few months, there were more moments like that. Decisions announced as conclusions, plans explained without prior discussion, changes mentioned casually, as if I'd already agreed to them. Each one is small, each one is easy to rationalize. I told myself I was being mature, that I didn't need to be involved in everything, that my parents trusted me to adapt, that inclusion wasn't the same as importance. What I didn't admit, because it felt melodramatic, was the growing sense that I was learning about my own family in the same way an acquaintance might, through updates, not participation. Once, I found out a major family plan had changed through a passing comment from a sibling. "Oh, didn't Mum tell you?" they said, genuinely surprised. I laughed it off. Must have slipped her mind. I became very good at making omissions feel accidental. That's what everyone else did too. The people around me weren't cruel. They were comfortable. Comfortable with the idea that I would adjust. Comfortable assuming that if I had a problem, I would say so. Comfortable not noticing that silence can be a form of accommodation, not consent. I didn't confront anyone because I couldn't yet name what was happening. There was no single incident to point to. No evidence is strong enough to justify discomfort. Just a pattern that hadn't fully formed. And so I did what I'd always done. I absorbed it. I didn't know then that this was the beginning of a long education. Not about money or documents or legality, but about hierarchy. About who is considered essential when decisions are made and who is informed afterward as a courtesy. The first small cut didn't change me overnight. It simply taught me that my presence was optional in ways I hadn't realized before. Once something happens more than once, it stops feeling like an exception. That's how normalization works, not through force, but through repetition. Each time a boundary is crossed without consequence, it becomes less visible, less remarkable. Eventually, it stops registering as a boundary at all. By the time I noticed the pattern clearly, I had already been living inside it. It wasn't that my parents stopped caring. It was that caring took on a particular shape, one that didn't include consultation. They assumed my agreement in advance. They assumed my flexibility, and I confirmed those assumptions every time I stayed quiet. I told myself I was choosing peace. When holidays were planned without asking me about dates, I adjusted my schedule. When family decisions were framed as done deals, I nodded and adapted. When conversations happened in my absence, and I was updated later, I thanked them for keeping me informed. Gratitude became my default response to exclusion. I can hear how that sounds now, but at the time, it felt reasonable, mature. I didn't want to be seen as difficult. I didn't want to create tension over things that, on the surface, seemed manageable. So I rationalized. They're busy. They didn't think I'd mind. It wasn't intentional. I don't need to be involved in everything. Each explanation was plausible. Together, they formed a story that made my discomfort feel unjustified. The more I normalized it, the easier it became for others to do the same. There's an unspoken social rule in families. The person who complains sets the agenda. As long as I didn't complain, there was no agenda to address. My silence created the illusion of harmony. And harmony, especially in families, is often protected at the expense of honesty. Sometimes, I'd feel a brief flare of irritation when I learned about a decision too late to influence it, or when my opinion was requested only after everything was finalized. But I would swallow it quickly. I told myself that reacting would be disproportionate, that I was being overly sensitive. I became very skilled at minimizing my own reactions. What I didn't realize was that every time I did that, I was teaching people how to treat me. Not through words, but through what I accepted without question. I wasn't being disrespected in loud, obvious ways. That's why it took so long to see it. This was quiet disrespect, the kind that wears the mask of efficiency, the kind that hides behind phrases like, "it just made sense," and "we didn't think you'd object." And they were right! I read it! There's a particular loneliness in being the reasonable one. You're trusted to handle things on your own, but never asked whether you want to. Your independence becomes a justification for your exclusion. I noticed that when I did speak up, gently, carefully, it was often brushed aside with reassurance rather than change. "Oh, you know how things are. It's not a big deal. We didn't mean anything by it." Intent was offered as a substitute for accountability. And because I didn't want to escalate, I accepted that substitution. Over time, I started to preemptively lower my expectations. I stopped assuming I'd be consulted. I stopped waiting for invitations to conversations. I adapted to the version of the family that existed rather than the one I thought I was part of. This is the quiet part people don't talk about. Before you're excluded externally, you often exclude yourself internally. You stop reaching because reaching has taught you it won't be met. I didn't feel angry. I felt resigned. Resignation can look a lot like peace from the outside. It's calm, controlled. It doesn't disrupt anyone. But inside, it carries a slow erosion, a sense that your presence is optional, your voice secondary. I still loved my family. That never changed. But love doesn't prevent hierarchy. Sometimes it disguises it. By normalizing these small dismissals, I helped maintain a system where my role was fixed and unquestioned. I was the one who would adapt, the one who would understand, the one who wouldn't push back. And as long as that remained true, there was no reason for anything else to change. I hadn't yet seen where this path was leading. I just knew that somewhere along the way, respect had quietly slipped out of the equation, and I had helped it do so by calling it understanding. Roles in families are rarely announced. They emerge slowly, shaped by habit, expectation, and repetition. By the time you recognize yours, it often feels too established to question. Mine was clear long before I named it. I was the reliable one. Not the decision maker, not the emotional center, not the future they worried about. I was the infrastructure, the person who filled the gaps, the one who could be counted on to show up, adjust, and not require much in return. Reliability sounds like a compliment, and in many ways it is. But in my family, it came with an unspoken trade-off. The more reliable I was, the less visible I became. When something needed to be done, I was assumed. When something needed to be decided, I was optional. I noticed how conversations shifted depending on who was in the room. When certain siblings spoke, my parents leaned in, asked questions, and debated options. When I spoke, the response was often a nod, a brief acknowledgement, then a return to the original plan. Not dismissive, just conclusive. It wasn't that my opinions were unwelcome, they just weren't necessary. I was consulted when confirmation was needed, not when direction was being set. I became the person whose agreement was assumed in advance, whose flexibility was built into plans as a given. And because I didn't resist, the role solidified. There's a particular kind of invisibility that comes from being useful. When your value is tied to how smoothly things run, your presence is only noticed when something goes wrong. As long as you're doing your job, supporting, adapting, accommodating, you fade into the background. I started to see how my parents spoke about me, rather than with me. Eleanor's fine with whatever. She doesn't mind. She's easy. Those statements were rarely checked. They didn't ask if they were still true. They had become part of the family narrative. And narratives, once established, are hard to interrupt without seeming disruptive. I remember a moment that clarified it for me. We were discussing a long-term plan, something that would affect everyone eventually. My mother paused, looked at me, and said, "You'll be okay with this, right?" It wasn't a question in the true sense. It was a request for reassurance, for continuity. If I had said no, the room would have shifted. I could feel it. Not because I would have been wrong, but because I would have been unexpected. So I said yes. That was the moment I understood my role wasn't just assigned, it was maintained. I had internalized the expectation that my comfort was secondary to stability, that speaking up would create friction I didn't feel entitled to introduce. I told myself that being agreeable was a form of generosity. But generosity without boundaries becomes self-erasure. The family didn't see me as someone who needed protecting or prioritizing. They saw me as someone who could take care of herself. And while that was true, it was also incomplete. Independence had become a reason to bypass me rather than respect me. I don't blame them entirely for this. Roles persist because they work for the system. And our family system worked precisely because I didn't complicate it. What I didn't see then was that the role of reliable and invisible comes with long-term consequences. When people categorize you as stable, they stop factoring you into plans that involve risk, legacy, or emotional investment. You become part of the present, not the future. I didn't realize how deeply that categorization had set in until much later. Until a document would confirm, in neutral legal language, what years of subtle behavior had already established. At this point in the story, I still believed my role was benign, functional, even honorable. I hadn't yet understood that roles, once fixed, determine not just how you're treated, but what you're entitled to. And I hadn't yet questioned whether I was willing to keep playing mine. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, no dramatic realization that split my life into before and after. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, in a moment so quiet that no one else noticed it at all. I was sitting alone in my apartment, reviewing notes from a client project. My phone buzzed with a message from my mother. Nothing urgent. Just a casual update about a logistical detail, something minor, something I would, as usual, adapt to. I read it once, then again. And for the first time, instead of immediately responding, I set the phone down. That pause was new. I noticed a strange sensation. Not anger, not sadness, but distance. A subtle internal step back. It felt like I was watching a familiar scene from slightly outside myself, noticing details I'd previously glossed over. The message wasn't unkind, but it assumed my compliance. It presented a decision as already made. It thanked me in advance for understanding. That phrase again. Normally, I would have replied with reassurance. Of course. No problem. Whatever works. But something in me hesitated. Not because I wanted to argue, but because I suddenly realized how automatic my responses had become. I wasn't choosing silence. I was defaulting to it. I sat there longer than necessary, letting that realization settle. I thought back over the years, how often I'd been informed rather than consulted, how often my flexibility had been assumed, how rarely anyone checked whether my circumstances had changed. And I saw, with an uncomfortable clarity, that nothing would shift unless I did. Not outwardly, internally. This wasn't about correcting anyone. It wasn't about making a point. It was about recognizing that my silence had been read as consent for a very long time. I finally replied to my mother's message with something neutral. No agreement, not refusal, just acknowledgement. That was it. No drama, no explanation. But inside, something had recalibrated. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider a question I had avoided for years. What if my role in this family isn't fixed? What if it persists only because I keep stepping into it? That question didn't make me angry. It made me alert. I began to notice patterns more clearly. How certain conversations happened without me. How decisions were framed in ways that left little room for input. How often my parents spoke in terms of efficiency rather than inclusion when it came to me. I also noticed how much energy I'd spent managing my own reactions, minimizing, rationalizing, adjusting, so that no one else had to feel discomfort. And I wondered what would happen if I stopped doing that work for them. Not as a threat, not as leverage, just as an experiment in presence. I didn't announce any change. I didn't confront anyone. I simply became more observant, more deliberate. I let myself feel moments of irritation without immediately dissolving them into understanding. There was a sense of quiet power in that. Not control, clarity. I realized that I had been treating harmony as a moral obligation rather than a shared responsibility. I had taken it upon myself to absorb the imbalance so that the surface remained smooth. That day I stopped doing that. Internally. Externally, nothing changed. I still showed up. I still listened. I still behaved kindly. But I no longer confused kindness with self-erasure. It was a small shift, almost invisible, but it altered the way I interpreted everything that followed. Because once you see your own role clearly, you can no longer pretend it was assigned without your participation. I didn't know then where this shift would lead. I didn't yet understand the full implications. I only knew that something had moved inside me, something that wouldn't settle back into its old shape. And from that moment on, silence was no longer my default. It was a choice. When silence is unconscious, it's easy to mistake it for weakness. When it becomes deliberate, people rarely notice the difference, at least not at first. After that quiet shift, I didn't suddenly start speaking more. In fact, from the outside, I probably seemed the same. I still listened. I still responded politely. I still didn't interrupt or demand space in conversations. But the silence had changed texture. Before, my quietness was an absence, an empty space others filled without resistance. Now, it was intentional, contained. I was no longer smoothing things over in my own head before anyone else had to. I stopped volunteering reassurance. When plans were announced, I didn't immediately say they worked for me. I said I'd check my schedule. When decisions were presented as final, I asked neutral questions, not to challenge, but to understand. I let pauses exist without rushing to dissolve them. No one commented on the change. But I could feel a subtle recalibration in the room, a slight uncertainty. People are used to patterns. When one shifts, even quietly, it registers somewhere, even if they can't name it. What surprised me was how quickly my silence was reinterpreted. Not as consideration, not as thoughtfulness, but as disengagement. "Oh, Eleanor doesn't really care about that," someone said once, casually. I noted it without reacting. The assumption had always been there. Now, without my constant affirmations, it surfaced more clearly. That was information. I realized then that my previous compliance hadn't been read as generosity. It had been read as indifference, or worse, availability without preference. So I stopped correcting that narrative. I didn't explain myself. I didn't defend my intentions. I simply allowed people to sit with the ambiguity. Silence, when chosen, creates space, and space reveals what others are used to taking for granted. In that space, I started paying closer attention to those who followed up, to those who didn't, to whose plans adjusted when I hesitated and whose didn't. I began to see the hierarchy more clearly, not in terms of love, but in terms of consideration, whose inconvenience mattered, whose absence caused concern, whose voice altered outcomes. And I noticed something else. My silence made others more comfortable continuing without me. That realization stung briefly, but it also clarified something essential. If my presence wasn't required for decisions to proceed, then my silence wasn't the problem. It was the confirmation. People didn't push me to speak. They didn't check in to see if I was okay. They simply moved forward, relieved by the lack of friction. And in that relief, the truth became unmistakable. I wasn't central to their calculations. Once I accepted that, the emotional labor stopped. I no longer felt responsible for maintaining balance. I stopped translating my quietness into reassurance for others. I also stopped sharing unnecessary information, not as a tactic, but as a boundary. If I wasn't being consulted, I didn't owe full transparency. I responded when asked. I offered what was required. Nothing more. This wasn't withdrawal, it was alignment. The more I aligned my responses with how I was actually being treated, the calmer I felt. There was no resentment, just accuracy. People continued as they always had. They assumed, they decided, they informed. And I watched, not with hurt, but with clarity. I understood then that my silence had never protected me. It had protected the system. Now, by choosing when to be silent and when not to be, I was no longer reinforcing a role I hadn't consciously agreed to. Others mistook this shift for distance, or disinterest, or strength, or weakness. I didn't correct them, because what mattered wasn't how they interpreted my silence, but that I finally understood it myself. And with that understanding came something I hadn't expected: leverage. Not over people, but over my own next move. While everyone else carried on as usual, I started paying attention in a different way. Not emotionally, structurally. I've always been good at seeing systems. It's part of what made me effective in my work. I notice patterns others dismiss as coincidence. I see how small decisions accumulate into outcomes people later claim were unpredictable. I'd never applied that skill to my own family before. Not fully. Families are emotional spaces. You're not supposed to audit them. You're supposed to feel your way through. But once silence became a choice, observation became inevitable. I began to notice how information flowed. Who was told what and when? Who was consulted early and who was updated late? Which conversations happened proactively and which only occurred in response to problems? The pattern was consistent. I wasn't part of the early loops. This wasn't about secrecy. It was about prioritization. Certain people were considered stakeholders. Others were considered stable variables, elements you didn't need to adjust for because they'd adapt on their own. I was a stable variable. Once I named that, I stopped taking it personally. Systems don't have malice, they have momentum. I also noticed something else. My parents relied on me more than they realized, not for decisions, but for continuity. I was the one who remembered details, the one who handled logistics quietly, the one who noticed when something had been overlooked and fixed it without announcement. They trusted me to keep things running smoothly in the background. And that trust, ironically, gave me access. I had always been the one helping with paperwork, organizing files, making sense of correspondence, reviewing documents when something seemed unclear. It was framed as assistance. It felt like responsibility. Now I saw it as information. Not in a sinister way, just in a factual one. I started keeping notes, not out of suspicion, but out of habit. Dates, decisions, who knew what and when. I didn't confront inconsistencies. I simply documented them. The more I did, the more I realized how much had been decided without me. Not just recently, but over the years. Financial plans, long-term arrangements, conversations about the future that assumed I would adjust to whatever was decided. I also noticed how rarely anyone asked me what I wanted long-term, where I saw myself, what I needed. Those questions weren't absent because people didn't care. They were absent because the answers weren't seen as structurally relevant. I was expected to fit in, not shape the plan. This wasn't something anyone would admit out loud. It didn't need to be said. It was embedded in behavior. And behavior is more honest than language. I didn't change how I acted outwardly. I remained helpful, polite, available when asked. That's why no one noticed the shift. What they didn't see was that I'd stopped filling gaps automatically. I let small inefficiencies exist. I let others handle things I'd once taken over instinctively. Not to punish, to observe. An observation revealed something crucial. When I didn't step in, things didn't fall apart. They just moved on without me. That was the confirmation. I also began to educate myself more deeply, not just professionally, but personally. I refreshed my understanding of legal structures, estate planning, how decisions are formalized, and how silence is interpreted in those contexts. I wasn't planning anything. I was orienting myself. There's a difference. Preparation doesn't always mean action. Sometimes it's about ensuring that if a moment arrives, you're not caught unaware. The more I learned, the clearer it became that my family's assumptions about me weren't just emotional. They had legal and structural implications. Being the easy one doesn't just shape how people treat you day to day, it shapes how they design the future. And futures, once designed, don't automatically include people who were never considered decision makers. What struck me most was how invisible this entire process was to everyone else. They thought nothing had changed. They thought I was the same Eleanor I'd always been. And in many ways I was. The difference was that I was no longer blind to the system I was part of. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel resentful. I felt clear. Clear about my position. Clear about my options. Clear about the fact that no one was going to suddenly wake up and reassess my role on their own. If anything was going to change, it would have to be intentional. And it would have to begin quietly. The discovery didn't come with a dramatic build-up. No ominous music. No gut punch moment where everything went silent. It arrived the way most consequential truths do, wrapped in normalcy, almost apologetic in its presentation. I was sitting in a lawyer's office because I'd been asked to help clarify something. A routine matter, framed as convenience. I was good with documents. I understood systems. It made sense to involve me. That in itself was familiar. The room was neutral. Light wood furniture, clean lines, the faint smell of paper and coffee. The lawyer spoke calmly, efficiently, assuming context I didn't yet have. They referenced documents, timelines, and decisions that had already been finalized. Then they slid a folder across the table. I opened it without expectation. What I saw wasn't shocking in a cinematic way. No red ink, no dramatic language, just absence. My name wasn't where it had always been assumed to be. There it was, clear, legal, impersonal. A structure of decisions that had been revised, updated, formalized, and I was no longer part of the core arrangement. The lawyer kept talking, unaware of the internal shift happening across from them. They explained things matter-of-factly, pointing to clauses, outlining a rationale that had nothing to do with emotion. I nodded. I asked a few clarifying questions. My voice stayed steady. Inside, something settled. Not pain, not anger. Confirmation. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't an oversight. It wasn't temporary. This was intentional, documented, and complete. My parents had changed the will without telling me. And they hadn't done it impulsively. It was careful, structured, thought through. That was the part that mattered most. I realized then that everything I had observed, the assumptions, the exclusions, the quiet decisions, had led here. This document wasn't an anomaly. It was the logical conclusion of years of behavior. I learned my place in the family through a document, not a conversation. And oddly, that made it easier to accept. Because documents don't lie to protect feelings. They don't soften truths. They don't pretend inclusion where there is none. They reflect priorities as they are, not as people claim them to be. I didn't feel the urge to confront anyone. There was nothing to clarify. The clarity was already there, in black and white. I thanked the lawyer. I closed the folder. I left. Outside, the day continued as if nothing had happened. Traffic moved. People walked past. The world didn't pause to acknowledge the internal recalibration that had just occurred. I sat in my car for a few minutes before driving away. Not to cry, but to think. I understood something fundamental in that moment. Exclusion hurts most when it's ambiguous, when you're left guessing whether you matter. When you're told one thing emotionally and shown another structurally. This wasn't ambiguous. This was definitive. And with definitiveness came an unexpected calm. I didn't feel diminished, I felt unburdened. The question of where I stood no longer hovered in the background. It had been answered conclusively. What surprised me most was how little grief I felt over the material aspect. This wasn't about money, it was about recognition, about being considered when futures are shaped. The absence of my name wasn't a loss of inheritance, it was a record of perception. And once perception is documented, it becomes something you can respond to. Strategically, deliberately, without emotion clouding the picture. I didn't tell anyone what I'd learned, not because I was hiding it, but because there was no need. This wasn't information meant to provoke a reaction. It was information meant to inform a decision. As I drove home, I didn't plan my next move. I didn't rehearse conversations. I didn't imagine outcomes. I simply acknowledged the truth I'd been given. They had already made their choice. Now quietly, it was my turn. There's a moment after clarity arrives where you're tempted to act immediately, to say something, to confront, to force a conversation that will finally acknowledge what's been left unsaid. I felt that impulse briefly, not as anger, but as momentum, as if understanding alone demanded response. But I didn't move, because clarity, when rushed, turns back into noise. Instead, I sat with the information, not passively, but deliberately. I let it settle into my understanding of the past, the present, and the future. I allowed myself to trace its implications without dramatizing them. What were my options? I could confront my parents directly. Ask why. Ask when they planned to tell me. Ask what assumptions had guided their decision. That path offered emotional release, but little else. I knew how that conversation would go. Reassurance, explanations framed as protection or practicality. A promise that it didn't mean what it looked like. And I knew myself well enough to know I would soften in response. I would accept ambiguity again. I could do nothing. Absorb the information and continue as I had before. That option was familiar. Comfortable. It would preserve surface harmony at the cost of internal alignment. Or I could accept the document as the most honest communication I'd been given and respond accordingly. That third option was quieter. It didn't involve confrontation. It didn't require permission. It was irreversible, not because of what it would do to others, but because of what it would change in me. I chose that one. The decision wasn't dramatic. It didn't feel empowering in the cinematic sense. It felt final, like closing a door gently but deliberately, knowing you won't reopen it out of habit. I decided to stop operating under assumptions that had never been formally shared with me. I decided to treat structural information as more reliable than emotional reassurance. I decided that my future would no longer be designed around roles I hadn't consciously agreed to. That meant redefining my relationship with my family, not emotionally, but practically. Practically. I didn't cut contact. I didn't withdraw affection. I didn't punish anyone. I simply recalibrated my involvement to match my actual standing. No more filling in gaps automatically. No more stepping into responsibilities that weren't explicitly mine. No more making myself available by default. I also decided not to disclose what I knew. Not out of secrecy, but because disclosure would shift the focus away from what mattered. This wasn't about explaining myself. It was about acting in alignment with reality. People often think decisions like this are fueled by resentment. But resentment requires engagement. This decision came from acceptance. They had made their plans. I was now free to make mine. The most irreversible part of the choice was internal. Once you stop hoping to be included, you stop organizing your life around the possibility of inclusion. That changes how you invest your time, your energy, your expectations. It changes how you show up. I felt no need to announce this shift. Announcements invite negotiation. I wasn't negotiating. I was adjusting. From that point on, my actions would be based on what was, not what I'd assumed would eventually be acknowledged. That's the thing about decision points. They often arrive quietly, disguised as information. They don't force your hand. They simply remove illusion. And once the illusion is gone, continuing as before becomes a choice you can no longer justify. Why? I didn't know yet how this decision would unfold. I didn't predict consequences. I didn't map reactions. I only knew that something fundamental had changed and that I would honor that change, even if no one else noticed it at first. Because the most important shifts rarely announce themselves. They just redirect the future. After the decision, life didn't slow down. If anything, it became quieter. in a way that felt intentional rather than hollow. I moved through my days with a new sense of alignment, not urgency, not secrecy, just precision. I didn't inform anyone that anything had changed. There were no boundaries announced, no ultimatums delivered. I simply began to act in ways that reflected my revised understanding of my role. I stopped being the default. When requests came in, small ones at first, I responded thoughtfully instead of automatically. Sometimes the answer was yes, sometimes it was no. Often it was, I can't help with that right now. No explanations, no justifications. That alone shifted the dynamic more than any conversation could have. I also began disentangling myself from responsibilities I had absorbed informally over the years. Documents I used to organize quietly, I returned them. Tasks I used to handle by habit, I redirected them. Not abruptly, gradually, calmly. I framed everything as capacity, not principle, because capacity is harder to argue with. Professionally, I made parallel adjustments. I reevaluated my long-term plans without factoring in assumptions about family proximity or availability. I made decisions based on what served my future, not what preserved convenience for others. No one noticed, at least not consciously. Families often rely on invisible labor. When that labor stops, the first reaction isn't recognition, it's confusion. Things don't break immediately, they just take longer. They require more coordination, more effort. I allowed that to happen. I also took steps that were entirely internal. I updated my own legal documents, clarified my intentions, ensured that my future would reflect my values, not inherited expectations. This wasn't retaliation, it was symmetry. I wasn't withdrawing support. I was aligning responsibility with recognition. What struck me during this period was how little resistance I encountered. No one challenged my changes. No one asked why I seemed less available. They adjusted around me, assuming circumstances rather than choice. That assumption worked in my favor. Silence, when combined with consistency, becomes a statement. And consistency is difficult to argue with. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt grounded. There's a misconception that power has to be visible to be real. In my experience, the most durable power is quiet. It doesn't seek validation. It doesn't provoke a reaction. It simply reshapes the landscape over time. As weeks passed, I noticed subtle shifts. Conversations happened later. Plans required more coordination. Decisions took longer. Still, no one connected it to me. I was no longer central enough to be blamed, but I had once been central enough to smooth everything over. The absence of that smoothing created friction no one had prepared for. And I stayed out of it, not out of spite, out of clarity. I had spent years absorbing the cost of efficiency so others wouldn't have to feel it. Now, I allowed the cost to be distributed where it belonged. This phase wasn't about winning. It was about letting reality function without my invisible intervention. I didn't know yet how this would culminate. I didn't anticipate reactions or outcomes. I simply maintained the alignment I had chosen. Moving in silence isn't about hiding. It's about not explaining yourself to people who didn't consult you when it mattered. And in that quiet, something irreversible continued to take shape without my needing to force it. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They emerged the way pressure does, gradually, unevenly, felt more than announced. At first, it was just an inconvenience. Small delays, minor misunderstandings, the kind of friction people attribute to bad timing rather than structural change. I noticed it immediately, others didn't. A task that used to be handled smoothly now requires multiple messages. A plan that once came together effortlessly now stalls. Someone forgot a detail I would have caught. Something important arrived late. None of it was catastrophic. That was the point. When invisible support disappears, systems don't collapse. They slow down. And in that slowdown, people begin to feel a loss they can't quite name. I heard it in passing comments. Things feel more complicated lately. I don't know why this is taking so long. We must be missing something. They were right, but no one looked at me when they said it. I was still present, still polite, still responsive when directly addressed. From the outside, nothing about my behavior suggested withdrawal. That's what made the shift so difficult to identify. I hadn't left. I just wasn't compensating anymore. At one point, a family plan nearly fell through. Not because anyone refused to help, but because no one had assumed the coordination role I used to fill quietly. The frustration in the room was palpable. People spoke over one another. Someone suggested we postpone. I watched calmly, not with satisfaction, with recognition. This was the cost of a system that had relied on unacknowledged labor. What struck me most was that the frustration wasn't directed at me. It was diffuse. People felt something was off, but they didn't know where to place it. Because I had never been labeled as essential, my absence from that role didn't register as a cause. You can't miss what you were never taught to see. I realized then that I had been functioning as a buffer, absorbing inefficiencies, translating chaos into calm, making things feel effortless so others didn't have to examine how much effort was actually required. And now, without that buffer, the effort was visible. But visibility doesn't automatically lead to insight. Instead of reconsidering assumptions, people tried to work around the friction. They compensated in their own ways. They adjusted timelines. They lowered expectations. Still, something had changed. I was no longer the person things defaulted to. And that slowly began to matter. Not emotionally, practically. I noticed that I was no longer looped in, even at the edges. Updates came later. Decisions were communicated more abruptly, not out of malice, but because my role had quietly shifted from support to non-essential. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same behaviors that had once made me indispensable had also made me easy to exclude. And now, without those behaviors, exclusion became more obvious. Yet no one asked why. Families often avoid asking questions whose answers might require change. I stayed consistent. That was key. Consistency removes the possibility that something is temporary. It forces others to adapt. And they did. They began to operate without factoring me in at all. That was the real consequence. Not frustration, not inconvenience, but recalibration. I had expected discomfort. I hadn't expected this level of emotional neutrality. They didn't confront me. They didn't pull me aside. They didn't express concern. They simply adjusted their expectations. And in doing so, they confirmed what the document had already told me. I wasn't central to the structure. I was optional. There was no bitterness in that realization anymore. Just accuracy. The consequences had begun, not as punishment, but as alignment. The system was now reflecting the truth of how I had been positioned all along. And once that reflection becomes visible, there's no returning to illusion. The shift became impossible to ignore when concern finally surfaced. Not concern for me, concern for the system. It started with questions that circled rather than landed. Casual check-ins framed as curiosity. You've been busy lately, haven't you? Everything okay? The tone wasn't accusatory. It wasn't even worried. It was unsettled. Something they had relied on was no longer functioning the same way, and they were trying to diagnose it without disturbing the structure that depended on it. That's how families often respond to change, by probing around the edges, hoping for reassurance that nothing fundamental has shifted. I offered none. I answered honestly, but narrowly. Yes, I was busy. Yes, everything was fine. No elaboration, no emotional cues inviting further discussion. The absence of detail made people uneasy. Soon after, I sensed panic, not loud, but internalized. Plans required more effort. Coordination felt heavier. The ease they'd grown accustomed to had vanished, and no one knew how to restore it. At one point, someone said almost to themselves, "We used to be better at this." I understood what they meant. They missed the version of the family that functioned smoothly without effort. They didn't yet realize that version had been subsidized by someone who no longer existed in that role. There was a brief window where repair might have been possible. Not structurally, that had already been decided, but relationally. A moment where someone could have said, "We didn't realize how much you were carrying." Or even, "We should have included you." No one did. Instead, explanations surfaced. External ones, circumstantial ones, busy schedules, changing priorities, age, stress. Anything but reassessment. And that's when I knew it was too late. Not because I was unwilling to talk, but because the nature of the concern revealed the limits of their awareness. They wanted the system restored, not the relationship re-examined. They wanted function, not understanding. By the time questions turned more direct, "Have we done something to upset you?" the answer was already irrelevant. Upset implies emotion. This wasn't emotional anymore. It was factual. I hadn't pulled away because I was hurt. I had stepped back because I had been formally positioned outside the core. That distinction matters. You can apologize for the hurt. You can repair a misunderstanding, but you can't undo a structure that's already been codified and then expect someone to continue behaving as if it hasn't. When people finally noticed my absence from certain roles, they framed it as a change in me, as distance, as withdrawal. They didn't frame it as a correction, and that framing told me everything. There were moments of awkwardness, pauses where someone seemed to consider asking more, then didn't. Attempts at normalcy felt slightly forced. I stayed calm through all of it, not detached, present, but no longer invested in restoring equilibrium at my own expense. The family system had reached a point of no return, not because of conflict, but because of inertia. Too many decisions had been made without me. Too many assumptions had hardened into policy. Even if someone had wanted to undo it, they wouldn't have known where to start. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt clear. Clarity doesn't require vindication. By the time the discomfort peaked, the opportunity for meaningful repair had passed. Not because I was unwilling, but because the focus had never shifted from convenience to accountability. And without that shift, nothing truly changes. They sensed loss without being able to name it. And I watched, understanding that the loss wasn't me. It was the version of me that had made everything easier while asking for nothing in return. That version wasn't coming back. Not out of punishment, out of self-respect. The conversation, when it finally happened, was almost anticlimactic. No one scheduled it. No one announced it. It emerged the way overdue things often do, awkwardly, in the middle of something else, when the tension became too inconvenient to ignore. We were sitting together after a family gathering. Most people had already left. The room felt quieter than usual, not peaceful, tentative. My mother broke the silence first. "You've been different lately," she said. Not angry, not accusing, just uncertain. I looked at her and nodded. Oh. That was it. No defense. No denial. My father shifted in his seat. We were wondering if we did something wrong. The phrasing mattered. Wrong implied emotion, hurt feelings, a misunderstanding that could be smoothed over with reassurance. I didn't rush to fill the space. "I don't think anyone did anything wrong," I said finally. "I think things were decided, and I adjusted. That made them uncomfortable. I could see it. Adjustment is supposed to be invisible. It's not meant to be acknowledged." My mother frowned slightly. "Adjusted how?" I answered calmly. "Precisely. I stopped assuming I was part of decisions I wasn't included in." There it was. No accusation, just a statement of fact. They exchanged a look. Not defensive, but surprised. As if this framing hadn't occurred to them. As if the possibility that their behavior had communicated something definitive was new. "We never meant to exclude you," my father said quickly. "I know," I replied. And I meant it. Intent wasn't the issue. The outcome was death. I didn't bring up the will. I didn't need to. The document had already done its work. This conversation wasn't about revealing information. It was about acknowledging reality. "I think we assumed you were okay with things," my mother said softly. "That's true," I said. "You assumed, and I confirmed it for a long time." There was no anger in my voice, no edge, just clarity. Silence followed. Not heavy, but reflective. The kind of silence where people realize something they can't easily undo. "I didn't say anything before because I didn't know how to," I continued. "And then eventually, I realized it wasn't something that could be talked into being different." They listened. Really listened. But listening doesn't always lead to change. My father nodded slowly. "We didn't realize it felt like that." "I know!" I said again. That phrase had become grounding. I wasn't there to convince them. I wasn't there to extract an apology. I was there to be accurate. There were no raised voices, no tears, no dramatic apologies. Just an acknowledgement that something had shifted, and that the shift wasn't temporary. "What do you want now?" my mother asked. It was an honest question, and it deserved an honest answer. "I want us to interact based on what's real," I said. "Not on assumptions about who I am or what I'll absorb." They nodded, uncertain but receptive. We didn't resolve everything in that conversation. We weren't supposed to. This wasn't a climax. It was a boundary being quietly established. When we stood to leave, nothing felt broken. But nothing felt the same either. And that was the point. I walked away, knowing that I hadn't demanded anything. I hadn't threatened distance or promised closeness. I had simply named the shift and let it stand. Confrontation doesn't have to be loud to be final. Sometimes the absence of heat is what makes it impossible to dismiss. The most unexpected change wasn't in my family, it was in me. After everything settled, after the silence, the observation, the decisions, and finally the conversation, I noticed how little emotional residue remained. No bitterness lingered, no urge to revisit the past or rewrite it. That surprised me. For a long time, I had assumed that self-respect would arrive with anger, that reclaiming space would require confrontation, maybe even grief. But what I felt instead was steadiness. I wasn't hardened. I was lighter. Without the constant internal calculation, how do I say this without upsetting anyone? How do I adapt so things stay smooth? My mind felt quieter. I stopped rehearsing conversations that never happened. I stopped anticipating needs that were never voiced. I also stopped confusing my value with my usefulness. That shift changed how I moved through every relationship, not just with my family. At work, I became more selective about what I absorbed. In friendships, I noticed when reciprocity was assumed rather than offered. I didn't resent it, I simply adjusted. The clarity was portable. With my parents, things didn't become warmer or colder. They became more honest. We spoke less frequently, but with fewer unspoken expectations. When I visited, I was a guest, not an operator behind the scenes. That distinction mattered. They began asking instead of assuming. Not always, not perfectly, but enough to signal that something had registered. And when they didn't, I no longer filled in the gaps automatically. I had learned that consistency teaches more than explanation ever could. I also learned that love doesn't require access to every part of you. You can care deeply and still draw lines. You can remain kind without being available by default. The person I am now is not quieter, but more precise. I still listen. I still choose my words carefully, but I no longer translate my silence into permission. Silence for me now is neutral. It doesn't mean yes. It doesn't mean I'm fine. It simply means I haven't decided to speak. That's a powerful distinction. I don't see myself as someone who was wronged. I see myself as someone who finally received accurate information and acted on it. The document didn't diminish me. It clarified me. It showed me where I stood so I could decide where to go. And where I've gone since then is a place of internal alignment, where my actions match my understanding, where my presence is intentional, where my absence, when it happens, is respected. I didn't need revenge to get there. I didn't need validation. I needed honesty, even when it arrived impersonally. People often ask whether I regret not saying something sooner. I don't. I spoke when I was ready, not to change the past, but to define the present. Who I am now is someone who no longer waits to be included to feel legitimate, someone who builds her life without requiring permission. Someone who understands that being underestimated is only a disadvantage if you stay where others have placed you. I didn't raise my voice. I raised my standards. And everything else adjusted accordingly. There's a temptation, when a story like this ends, to look for a villain, someone to blame, someone whose actions can be isolated and condemned, so everything else feels clean and resolved. D. But that's not how this unfolded. And it's not how most real family dynamics work. No one set out to hurt me. No one woke up one morning and decided I didn't matter. What happened was quieter, and because of that, more instructive. I was slowly reclassified, not through conflict, but through convenience, not through cruelty, but through assumption. My silence, my reliability, my willingness to adapt were interpreted as permanence, as proof that I didn't need to be considered when futures were shaped. And the document didn't create that truth. It revealed it. That's the part I want to linger on, because it's easy to miss. Paperwork didn't betray me. It simply stopped pretending. It showed me, without emotion or explanation, where I stood when sentiment was removed from the equation. And that clarity, uncomfortable as it was, gave me something invaluable: choice. Before, I was reacting to a story I hoped would eventually include me. After, I was responding to reality as it actually existed. That shift changed everything. The moral of this story isn't that you should walk away from your family. It isn't that you should confront every slight or demand recognition. It's not even that you should always speak up. It's this: pay attention to structure, not reassurance. Listen less to what people say about how they feel and more to how they design their decisions. Watch who is consulted early, notice who is assumed to adapt, look at where silence is convenient, and who pays for it. And most importantly, understand that quiet people often carry more than anyone realizes, not because they are weak, but because they are capable. Capability, when unacknowledged, becomes invisible labor. Invisible labor becomes expectation, and expectation, left unexamined, becomes entitlement. There is no justice in exploding after years of silence, but there is justice in alignment, in choosing actions that reflect reality instead of hope, in stepping out of roles that were assigned without consent, in allowing systems to feel the absence of what they never learned to value. I didn't win anything tangible. What I gained was something far more durable. Self-respect without hostility, distance without bitterness, clarity without cruelty. And that kind of quiet dominance doesn't announce itself. It doesn't humiliate. It doesn't demand applause. It simply changes what you will and will no longer carry. If this story resonated with you, I want to ask you something. Not rhetorically, but genuinely. Have you ever realized your place in someone's life, not through what they said, but through what they planned without you? If you have, I'd love to hear how you responded, silently or otherwise.